This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor at Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. In our day and time, it's considered necessary that we spell out what we mean when we say we believe in God. More than that, we are required to spend some time making a case to other people that to believe in God is reasonable and rational, and not simply the lazy nod of our heads to the traditions and delusions that we may have inherited from our parents. God talk is popular these days. Even 20 or 30 years ago, there was a lot of heat generated by a group of authors who came to be known as the New Atheists, publishing their books that made a splash as they rehearsed the common arguments against belief in God for a new generation. It was no contest as far as the recognition went. Their books were big hits and their names were on the lips of everyone. There was Richard Dawkins and his complaint about believers who didn't know anything about science. There was Christopher Hitchens, who hit the presses with a couple of books condemning the history of Islam. He proved to be ecumenical by also publishing a book that was an extended hit piece describing Mother Teresa as a maniac. And there was the newcomer among them, Sam Harris, whose fresh-faced approach seemed to usher in a whole new generation of new generation unbelievers. It was a heady time for the denizens of godly denial. One aspect of their success seemed to be the undercurrent that somehow their ready theses were brave condemnations of comfortable and sloppy and unexamined beliefs in God. As they hit the talk show circuit, they were often celebrated as brave, lone voices, willing to finally tell the truth about things the way they saw them. Like prophets crying in the wilderness of lonely truthfulness, their voices were shrill and petulant because they had to yell at the top of their lungs to be heard from amid all those who were shouting back at them. Or something like that. Of course, it wasn't that way at all. They became media darlings, first of all, because there's nothing the media likes better than what they understand, and nothing is better understood than saying no to God. These books were their generation's copy of books that have been published in every generation for the last 300 years or so. The new atheists are something like the new pornographers. They're stuck saying their version of old things because there's only so much material to work with in practically limited ways. And secondly, because their position has now become the comfortable point of view of our society. Even 20 years ago, the statistics about belief in God were beginning to head south. And so up to today, it's no contest that their books became bestsellers. Now, several of those authors are still around. Christopher Hitchens did die some years ago. We who are smugly on the side of the question of whether there is a God or not assure ourselves that Christopher now knows a whole lot more about the existence of God than he did those decades ago when he was notably expositing his ideas. But the others are still writing and still opining on the impossibility of belief and all of the other silliness that fills the heads of average people. Although at this remove in time, the pace has picked up a good deal. It has now become almost a foregone conclusion that belief in God is cratering everywhere. And so it is the case that explanations of our belief in God is what's expected. This is just the other side of the popularity of belief in no God. Since so many are convinced belief is old-fashioned and meaningless, we believers now find ourselves in the position of living within the expectations of justifying the foundations of belief. It's not enough to say God and have everyone understand or have the rest of the world nod in agreement. In fact, we can't even get the world to nod in agreement on what is meant by the term God. At least in the old days, everyone had a common understanding of what we claimed when we invoked the divine. Now you can go through the pages of the most popular atheists, and they themselves don't even bother to understand what belief in God really is. They're content simply with their disgust and their derision without really knowing very much about God, period. It certainly is an interesting aspect of the state of things. As the author David Bentley Hart has pointed out over and over, many of the new atheists continue to make claims about what we believe and why it's impossible to hold such beliefs in our age, all the while their assertions about our beliefs have nothing to do with what any rigorous and informed believer has ever held. Their arguments are straw man arguments, placed in front of the audience to be knocked over with the slightest gesture. Many times these proponents don't even know how shallow their contact with our belief is. But it's part of the spirit of the age. Certainly during the other ages when belief was the norm for everyone, we were content to allow people all variation of beliefs without worrying too much about whether they had things just right or not. If atheists want to attack what's foolish and contradictory and fantastic about what some believers hold to be true, it may be logically weak, but we can affirm that some people may have believed such things, or at least believed them in uninformed ways. So it's not so awful that these authors aren't all that careful with their argumentation. But the fact is, they don't really have to be. Most people in our day and time are disposed to go along with the notion, even if it's pretty lightly held. It's in the water. We are suspicious of believing in God, and it's no longer natural to be formed in a societal notion of God at work in the world. The average person who doesn't believe in the average person just doesn't believe the way he used to, which is why we're called upon to justify our teachings about God and address the complaints and objections concerning what it means to believe. This is the aspect of our age. It's all the rage among the church these days. We're no longer living in the age of Christendom, where the whole world believes without question, and all of the values of society are oriented to support our understanding of the outlines of the faith. Instead, we've regressed to a time in which our claims are disbelieved and our presumptions are questioned about everything. That means we have to be ready to talk about God in relatable and intelligent ways, not just presume everybody knows what we mean, or even knows that there is something to know when it comes to the existence of God. We've gotten to the point in which we have to be equipped. In the previous age, certainly amid the one I grew up in, such was not the case. The church had worked hard to make belief a part of the culture and to make the culture support belief. From our perspective these days, people are often highly critical of that achievement, as if our ancestors were tricking themselves or doing something poorly in their practice of the faith. But they, in fact, were doing exactly what we want to do. Their difference is that they were successful. They were able to form the pillars of the culture so that it supported the whole expanse of the faith. In many cases, they were brilliant in their achievements. They created a Christian culture. And what does a Christian culture do? Well, first of all, a culture in its simplest form is just what's normal at your house. In your house, what you take for granted in your experience and your expectations, that's what your culture is. Where I grew up, everyone in the family was Catholic, and being Catholic especially meant we went to church on Sunday without exception. And it was everybody. And it wasn't a choice. It would have been unthinkable if someone had mentioned that my cousin had slept in on Sunday and had missed Mass, or that my grandmother had grown angry at the priest and had decided not to go to church anymore. There weren't opinions about these things. The matter-of-fact realities of every day included the practice of the faith. Opinions and disagreements had nothing to do with it. Along with being Catholic and practicing the faith, you could expect to, eat 3 meals a day. You could expect the walls of the house to hold up the roof and that the roof not leak, and 1,000 other things. All of these were expected without question. It was the unspoken content of the culture, including the culture of belief. And that's an achievement. We didn't spend much time talking about the content of what we believed. We simply went out and practiced it. There weren't any conversations about what St. Paul may have said about salvation, or what the position of the popes was with regard to free markets, or what the constituents of a just war were supposed to be. Nobody talked about the content of the faith, only about what it meant to practice it. Just go along with what everyone expected, and every part of the faith would be enacted in you. All that you had to do was just the next thing, and you were carried along toward the goal of all faith naturally. That's what the culture of belief does for you. It's easy, and it relieves you of a lot of burdens. But when the culture is no longer of the faith, then things start looking different. If your faith is no longer a component of your culture, then it's no longer automatic. Just going along with things won't get you anywhere closer to the faith at all. In fact, it'll take you away from it. If you're not aware of the change in culture, it's easy to wake up one day, having done just what you saw your parents do in their generation, which was to do the next thing. But in our generation, you wake up and find out there's nothing of the faith in your life anymore, doing the next thing. All you've done is go along with the expectations and practices of everyone else. But instead of being faithful and secure in the church, the life of faith recedes until it disappears. A couple of years ago, I was speaking to an Australian Catholic who had come to the U.S. to begin a TV ministry. It was the extension of the program he had started down under in order to promote the faith. So I asked him what had prompted him to take such a step, and he told me that it was the Catholic high school that he had taught at there in Australia. At that particular school, they award a scholarship every year to a student's family. That helps to defray expenses, and it's a real aid for the finances as well as a means of recognizing the student. One of the prerequisites of the award is that it goes to a family who practices the faith. In that particular year, they couldn't find not one of the student's family that went to Mass. And so the scholarship wasn't awarded. That was a Catholic high school. The pillars of the culture, with everyone simply going along with the norms of expectation and performance, had collapsed. And it had happened with almost no one noticing. The only way back from there is hard work, to move against the culture. That means we have to learn the information our parents took for granted. We're tasked to learn the answers they never learned because we're faced with questions they never asked. And even more exhausting, we have to become responsible for what it means to choose to believe, something none of them in that culture ever had to do. Everyone I knew when I grew up was born into the faith and never had to think once of whether to embrace it or not. They weren't oppressed by it. Everybody I knew was happy enough with it, but it wasn't because they had examined all possible options and had fallen in love with it. It was because it was the content of their lives, and they were content with it. It was something like having a sister, the one you were born with as your companion throughout life, compared to having a wife. The sister is what you receive as part of the story of your life. You don't choose sisters or contemplate whether you're compatible with them or not. You simply live with them, and both of you, or all of you, fit into life together. Having a wife, on the other hand, is a choice. It is the product of effort and commitment. And this can only be done with intentionality. When the culture of belief no longer works, all of us have to begin to court the faith until we can commit to it. If we don't, we become bachelors and old maids among it. The culture, apart from faith, makes believing tougher. Of course, the common thing to do is to begin with the standard arguments about the existence of God, and those are compelling enough if you have the time to go through them. Throughout the history of the church, they've been popular. Certainly they were more popular in times gone by than now, but even today they have their cachet. You can look up on the internet and find all the major ones easily. For those who like to engage in exercises concerning the history of thought, these are particularly interesting because they haven't changed much over the years. Reading Anselm or St. Thomas and their discussion of the existence of God is to find almost all of the modern objections and certainly the modern discourse addressed directly. These guys, they weren't dumb. They knew what they were talking about, and their arguments were compelling. So look up what they had to say and see what it sounds like to you. And if you'd like a recommendation about where to start, I'd go to any of the books by Edward Feser. He certainly does a remarkable job of getting to the important stuff, and he keeps the reader's attention. This is where we begin the notion of rearranging culture. We get to it by becoming aware of what we believe and what we know. Truthfully, if we can at least come to the notion that our ancestors weren't dunces and actually knew what they were talking about, we'd have a much warmer notion of who we are and where we come from. We might even find a pathway to return to that culture of belief we long for but don't understand very well. After all, if our current culture is based on doubt concerning God or the frank abandonment of it, then believing in God is bound to result in some change in that culture. It's the inverse of what we've seen in our lifetimes. If we have awakened one day to find everything pointed in another direction because no one takes the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus seriously, then when we are serious about it, things would change. To embrace God would be to make what we do different than before. If you don't feel up to the rigors of the deep, hard proofs about God, then I suggest you go to David Bentley Hart's book, The Experience of God. Now, don't get me wrong, his book is deep and intellectual. In fact, it's delightfully so, and his opening chapters describing where we are in the face of the modern criticisms about believing in God are actually thrilling. If you like the bracing thrill of lean argumentation, which I've found can have the same effect as cold, high air. Reading the second chapter of his book is good all on its own. And just in case you find this sort of thing, if you like this sort of thing, then read his response to the review of his book that was in the New Yorker in 2014. He loves disputation, and he's mightily, wonderfully good at it. But the best part of the book is that he approaches the traditional talk about the existence of God from another direction. In fact, I find his musings much more engaging than most of the other books I've seen. In this work, the existence or the experience of God, he approaches the question of God's existence from the three principal experiences of what it means to be human. From these principal experiences, he builds into an understanding of what we mean when we say human experience and what our experience discloses to us, namely the existence of God. This isn't all that different than the classical discussions, but I find it more compelling. And these three basic experiences are being, consciousness, and bliss. The awareness of these constituents of humanity, which have been perennial through all of the ages of humanity, allow us to begin to think about believing in the divine. None of them begin with the question about revelation of morality. Morality, which in our age seems to be the great block about any transcendental question. We're always suspicious that if we find an answer to a question, it might compel us to do something that might constrain us, or worse, force us to agree with those people who talk about restraint or unpleasant boundaries. Instead of that, Bentley Hart begins with noting the depth of our experience and what that depth might disclose to us. This invitation to explore is much more interesting and compelling of a way into the question. If all this sounds too complicated, and I do admit Bentley Hart is a professional theologian who expects his readers to follow in the grooves that he spent a lot of time etching, there's another place to start. Go to C.S. Lewis and read the first couple of chapters of Mere Christianity. It's a book that was published a long time ago, but it has the advantage for us of having begun as a series of radio talks. His examples are from the everyday, and his invitation to consider what we know about ourselves is non-threatening. Lewis had spent his life as a teacher and lecturer about stories and storytelling, and he had developed a reputation as a multi-talented author, and his abilities are all on display in this work. And while it may not sound as fresh as it first did when it was on the radio, it certainly is worth going to and looking at. I guarantee you'll learn something from it. Certainly you'll learn how to hit some of the curveballs pitched to you from those who don't share our point of view. In all of this, the authors are asking us to think about what we know and how we experience the world. Most of the people I've encountered who are actively hostile to belief in God think they have the question all rolled up simply by asserting that they don't believe. They think it's enough to claim that once they may have believed these things and now they don't. And so that settles it. It's important for us to be able to affirm what we know as knowable and as in line with the human condition so as to continue the conversation, or so that it at least, the conversation, can go somewhere. There's nothing more dull than having someone say, "That's how it is for me, and I don't care what you say." But with these resources, but all that being said, with all of these resources available to us, I have to say, none of them have convinced me to believe in God. My belief is rooted in my experience and has been shaped by my history. All of these other reflections are simply additional information, supplementing what I've already discovered and what I already know to be true. And there are two sources of this conclusive belief for me. One is broad and impersonal. I'm not sure it's any more direct or accessible than Bentley Hart's book. The other is direct and intimate. I don't know if many others can relate to it, but both of these are important to me. The first is simply to acknowledge that my life was shaped by my belief in God, inherited from my family and from my circumstances. I was raised on the steady confidence in God's accompaniment, and I've never doubted it. As my life has taken its twists and turns, as all lives do, every turn I have been able to trust in and have come to know the presence of God with me. While this might not sound particularly convincing to someone else, it has been conclusive with me. A year ago, during a conversation with a young person who doubted her belief in God, she accused me of believing just because others told me to. Now, I outweigh her accumulation of years by almost 5 decades. I'm safe in saying my belief outweighs her accusation. It's simply been a part of my life, one that I have always been able to trust. That's the first thing. The second thing is more direct and more poignant. When I was 23, my father took ill and died very quickly. On the night of his death, my brothers and sisters and I were gathered in his hospital room as he took his last breaths. He was laboring in his last moments, and with one great sigh, he died. At that moment, looking into his face, it was impossible for me to believe that his life had simply disappeared. I knew, from the richness of the moment and the power of his presence there, his life was not simply whisked away, but had progressed on. I knew he lived even though he had died. It was impossible to imagine he simply stopped existing. Now, neither of these experiences are proofs of God's existence. Not even for me are they so. But they are windows into the truth of my life, allowing what is there to be seen. And the presence of God has always been real and powerful to me. I know this to be true. God exists and is real because of what I have seen and because of what I know. This knowledge underlies everything in my life. We are not speechless in our age. It is our invitation to speak what we know and to witness to the truth of our lives. When we do this, what we know informs the lives of all those around us. And if we witness to them, we might even change the world. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called Charity. What is charity? No, I mean it. What will it be? The guiding duty doled out at Christmas, pledged reluctantly? Perhaps the whim of a night's excess against all that's fit and trim. Maybe a wondering passing interest, the briefest glance giving at another's behest. But why not love actually, stepping aside to react factually, reordering life's pathway beyond the regular boundaries, beyond its stay, so that the missing face is seen, the one of Jesus' immortal grace, a gateway to salvation, a sure touch, the instantiation of true promise given to all of us, sinner or shriven, that when we find charity, it is where Christ is inherently. That's charity. In the weeks to come, I hope that we can together explore what it means to be living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.